You think your 9 to 5 is a grind? You sit at a desk, you complain about bad Wi-Fi? But 200 years ago, you didn't have a cubicle, you had a bucket. People literally waded through human waste just to buy bread. Here are 4 jobs from the 1800s that shouldn't exist. The knocker-upper. He fired peas at your window to wake you up. The pure finder. She grabbed dog poop off the street and sold it. The tosher. He waded through sewers for lost coins. And the leech collector. They let blood-sucking worms eat their legs just to catch them. If you like these stories, hit subscribe, comment with what we should cover next, and tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city below. Now let's go to 1800s London. See how this madness started. Imagine you're standing in a field in 1800. It's quiet. You hear birds. You hear the wind. You think this is how it's always going to be. Then you hear about the machines. You hear about Manchester. You hear that a man can make more in a week at a factory than he can in a month on a farm. So you pack a bag, you grab your family, you start walking. You aren't the only one. Hundreds of people are on the same road, then thousands. It's a stampede. You get to the city, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smoke. It's thick, it's black, it tastes like metal. You look up, and you can't see the clouds. You just see chimneys, hundreds of them. They pump out soot that falls like black snow. You need a place to live, but there aren't enough houses, not even close, so you find a cellar. It's damp, the walls sweat. You share it with 3 other families. You don't have a bed, you have a pile of straw in the corner. You pay rent for that straw. You work 14 hours a day. You come home and someone else is sleeping in your spot. You kick them out. You lie down. You do it again tomorrow. This is how London went from a city to a cage. In 1800, it had 1 million people. 50 years later, it had over 2 million. It doubled in a single lifetime. The people who built these cities didn't think about the basics. They didn't build sewers. They didn't build water lines. They didn't even hire police. You're on your own. If someone grabs your coat and runs, he's gone. No one is coming to help you. Think about the trash. There's no garbage man. There's no bin out back. If you have scraps or a broken chair or a dead cat, you throw it out the door. The alleys fill up. The piles get 2 or 3 feet high. They rot. They ferment. The smell gets so heavy you can feel it on your tongue. Then there's the human problem. 2 million people. No toilets. Think about that for a second. Most people had a bucket. That's it. You'd use it all day. Then at night, you'd walk to the window and empty it right onto the street. If you were lucky, you'd shout a warning. If you weren't, you'd just let it fly. It would hit the pavement and run down into the middle of the road. It formed these slow-moving rivers of filth. And you had to walk through it. There was no other way to get to work. You'd see kids playing in it. You'd see pigs eating it. And when it rained, it didn't wash away. It just spread. It seeped into the ground. It soaked into the wooden foundations of the houses. The whole city started to smell like an open grave. But people still needed water. Since there were no pipes, you went to the street pump. You'd stand in line with your pail. You'd pump the handle and wait for the water to come out. But remember where all that waste went. It went into the ground. It went into the same ground where the well was. You'd look in your bucket, and the water would be gray. It would be cloudy. Sometimes it would have bits of stuff floating in it. You drank it anyway. You had to. If you didn't, you died of thirst. If you did, you might die of something else. The streets were a slaughterhouse for your senses. You had the coal smoke choking your lungs, you had the filth covering your shoes, and you had the horses. London ran on horsepower. That meant thousands of animals. They worked until they dropped. When a horse died in the middle of the street, no one came to pick it up. They just left it there. It would sit in the sun for days. It would bloat. It would start to leak. People would just walk around it like it was a piece of furniture. This wasn't a mistake. This was the cost of the modern world. We wanted the clothes, we wanted the tools, we wanted the money, and this is what it looked like on the ground. It was a disaster. It was a ticking time bomb. Diseases would rip through a block in a weekend and kill half the children. But here's the thing. Where there's a mess, there's a job. When the city gets this broken, someone has to fix it. Not because they're heroes, but because they're hungry. This filth wasn't just gross. To some people, it was a gold mine. They saw that pile of trash and they didn't see rot. They saw a way to buy a loaf of bread. They're the reason the city didn't just drown in its own waste. They went into the places no one else would go. They touched the things no one else would touch. And if you think your job is bad, you haven't seen anything yet. We're going to look at the people who lived in the dark, the ones who hunted for scraps in the tunnels, the ones who collected what everyone else threw away. This is how they survived. This is how the Industrial Revolution actually worked. Picture a city that never stops eating. It swallows coal. It swallows iron. It swallows people. But here's the thing about eating. You always leave something behind. In the 1800s, London was choking on its own leftovers. If you walked down the street, you weren't just stepping over mud. You were stepping over money. You just didn't know it yet. Most people think the Industrial Revolution was all about steam engines and big gears. It wasn't. It was about the hustle. If you didn't have a spot on a factory floor, you were dead, unless you invented a job. You had to look at a pile of trash and see a steak dinner. You had to look at a dead dog and see a week's worth of rent. Everything had a price, every single scrap. Nothing stayed on the ground for long. If you dropped a rag, someone grabbed it before it hit the dirt. They didn't do it because they liked cleaning. They did it because the paper mills paid for cotton. If you didn't find enough rags, you didn't get your bread. Simple as that. Look at the fireplaces. Every house had one. They burned through mountains of coal every winter. That left ash, tons of it. You'd think ash was worthless. It's just burnt dust, right? Wrong. Brickmakers needed that ash. They mixed it into the clay to make the bricks that built the very houses the ash came from. It was a circle, a dirty gray circle. Men called dustmen spent their lives lugging heavy baskets of the stuff. They breathed it in until their lungs turned black. They did it so they could buy a pint of beer at the end of the shift. If they stopped hauling, the city stopped building. Then you had the bone pickers. They'd wander the alleys with a sack over their shoulder. They looked for the scraps from dinner, a rib bone, a skull, anything hard. They took them to the crushers. The bones became fertilizer for the farms or glue for the carpenters. If you found a big enough bone, you might even buy a pair of shoes. If you found nothing, you slept in a doorway. The streets were a battlefield. You weren't fighting soldiers. You were fighting other hungry people for the right to a pile of horse manure. Think about that. Thousands of horses pulling carriages. They leave a mess. To you, it's a smell. To a street orderly, it's a paycheck.
They'd scrape it up and sell it to the farmers outside the city. They used their bare hands. They didn't have gloves. They didn't have soap. They just had a bucket and a deadline. It sounds gross because it was, but this was the first gig economy. No boss, no safety net, just you and the gutter. If you were fast, you ate. If you were slow, you starved. The city didn't care about your feelings. It cared about its own gears. You had kids crawling into the Thames at low tide. They were called mudlarks. They'd wade through the freezing muck up to their knees. They looked for dropped coins or bits of old iron. Their feet got sliced open by broken glass. The salt water stung the cuts. They didn't stop to cry. Crying doesn't pay for coal. They just kept digging. If a kid found a piece of copper, that was a win. That meant fire for the night. The whole city ran on this. It was a giant machine that recycled itself. One man's waste was another man's bloodline.
You couldn't afford to be squeamish. You couldn't afford to have a weak stomach. You looked at the world and you saw materials. You saw leverage. But these people lived on the edge of a knife. They survived by finding value in the things we wouldn't even touch today. They turned the city's filth into survival. It was brutal, it was raw, and it was the only way the whole system kept spinning. But there was one job that was worse than the rest, a job that involved the most disgusting thing you can imagine, and people fought over the right to do it. They'd spend all day on their hands and knees for it. Why? Because the factories couldn't live without it. They needed it to make the things the rich people wore every day. Let's talk about the collectors. That's a fancy word for something very, very foul. And it starts with a dog. You think that's bad? Scraping dog dung off a sidewalk for a living? It's foul. It's disgusting. But at least the dog poop doesn't scream at you if you're late. See, the Industrial Revolution changed how we look at the sun. Before the factories, you woke up when the sky got bright. You slept when it got dark. Nature set the pace. Then the steam engine showed up. Those machines don't sleep. They don't get tired. And the men who owned those machines wanted their workers at the looms long before the sun even thought about rising. If you worked in a mill in Manchester or a coal mine in Wales, the clock was your god. But here's the problem. You're poor. You live in a cramped room with 6 other people. You can't afford a watch. You definitely can't afford a clock. Most of those didn't even have alarms yet anyway. So if you oversleep, you're dead. Not literally, but your wallet is. The boss locks the factory gate at 5:01 a.m. You're outside, you lose the day's pay. Do it twice, you're fired. In a world with no safety net, that's a death sentence. Your kids don't eat because you stayed in bed 20 minutes too long. So you hire a knocker-upper. Every morning, around 3 or 4 a.m., these people crawled out of their own beds. They were usually the ones the system had already chewed up. Old men, widows, people too worn out for the heavy lifting of the factories. They stepped out into the dark. They carried the tools of the trade. Usually it was a long bamboo pole, 20 feet long, maybe a heavy stick with a bunch of wire loops fixed to the end. They walked the narrow alleys. They looked for the marks on the doors. See, you'd take a piece of chalk and write your wake-up time on your front step or the brickwork. That was the contract. You paid them a few pence a week, and they promised to drag you out of your dreams. The knocker-upper reaches your window. They don't pound on the door. If they did that, they'd wake up the whole street,
And why give away for free what people are paying for? No, they take that bamboo pole and they tap on the second-story glass. Tap, tap, tap. It's a soft sound, just enough to cut through a snore. They aren't trying to be polite, they're being precise. They don't just tap and walk away either. That's how people get fired. They stay there. They keep tapping until they see your face at the glass. They wait for the signal, a nod, a wave. Only then do they move to the next house. If your window was too high, or if they didn't want to carry a pole, they'd use a different trick. There was a woman named Mary Smith in East London. She was a legend in the trade. She didn't like poles, too heavy, too clunky when the wind picked up. She used a pea shooter. She'd stand in the middle of the street, fill her cheeks with dried peas, and fire them at the windows like a machine gun. Click, click, click. Imagine being dead asleep and hearing a hail of legumes hitting your window pane. It worked. She made a decent living firing peas at her neighbors. She was the most reliable alarm in the East End. Think about the pressure on these people. You're a knocker-upper. You've got 100 people on your route. If you oversleep, 100 families don't eat that day. If you skip a house because your feet are frozen to your boots, that guy loses his job. You are the human battery that starts the city's engine. Without you, the gears don't turn. The mill stays silent. The owner loses money. And the owner doesn't like losing money. And who wakes the knocker-upper? That's the big joke of the era. Most of them just didn't sleep much. They stayed up late. They lived on coffee and grit. Or they had a deal with the local night watchman to kick their door in at 3 a.m. They were the ghosts of the morning. You'd hear the sound of their boots on the stone, the rattle of the pole against the glass. Then they'd vanish before the sun came up. By the time the factory whistle blew, the knocker-upper was finished. They were heading back to their own bed, or to a second job, or to the pub to warm their bones. They were the first line of defense against the machine. They turned human beings into parts of a giant clock. It was a living. It was a hard, cold, lonely living. But in a world where time was literally money, they were the ones who held the keys. If they didn't show up, the world didn't start. They were the masters of the morning, holding a bamboo pole instead of a scepter. While those guys were busy waking up the city, another group was already knee-deep in its bowels. You didn't need a bamboo pole for this job. You just needed a pair of boots you didn't mind losing. Or, more likely, you went in barefoot. The Thames wasn't a river back then, not like you see it now. It was a slow-moving, open sewer. Everything the city didn't want ended up there. Human waste from the privies, dead horses, scraps from the slaughterhouses, toxic runoff from the tanneries. And when the tide went out twice a day, it left behind a mile of stinking black mud. That mud was where the mudlarks lived. You'd see them huddled under the bridges, waiting. They were kids mostly, 6, 7, 8 years old. Or they were old men who had been chewed up and spit out by the factories. They didn't have a boss. They didn't have a paycheck. They had a sack and a prayer. The tide is the boss here. It tells you when to work and it tells you when to die. When the water starts to pull back, it reveals the bank. It isn't sand. It's a thick, gray paste. It looks like it's alive. It bubbles. That's the gas escaping from the rotting layers underneath. You step onto it and you sink to your shins. You don't walk on this stuff. You wade. You struggle. The second the mud showed its face, they ran.
They didn't have gloves. They used their bare hands to rake through the slush. They weren't looking for gold. They were looking for trash. They looked for coal first. Huge chunks fell off the barges that fed the city's furnaces. They grabbed it. They shoved it in their pockets. They looked for rope, old hemp they could pick apart and sell back to the shipyards. They looked for copper nails. Ships were held together with them back then. If a nail fell out of a hull, it was worth a loaf of bread. Think about the cold. It wasn't just a chill. It was the kind of cold that turns your feet into blocks of wood. They'd stand in that freezing muck for hours. They'd crawl on their hands and knees, feeling around in the dark slime. They couldn't see what they were touching. They just felt. They'd cut their palms on broken glass. They'd puncture their feet on rusty scrap metal. The water was toxic. Those cuts didn't just hurt. They turned into infections. Those infections turned into rot. You didn't die from the work. You died from the water inside the work. Your leg would swell up. It would turn black. Then you were done. But you kept going. You had to. Imagine a 10-year-old boy. He's got no shoes. He's got a torn coat held together with string. He spots a piece of iron. It's heavy. It's half buried. He digs with his fingers. The mud is thick like clay. It sticks under his fingernails. It gets in his eyes. He pulls. The mud fights back. It creates a vacuum. It wants to keep the iron. He tugs until his muscles burn. He gets it free. He throws it into his basket. That's his win for the hour. That piece of iron might fetch him enough for a bowl of gruel. Just one. You have to see the scale of this. London was the biggest city on earth. It ran on coal. Thousands of tons moved on that river every day. The barges were overloaded. They hit a wave, and the coal spilled. To a mudlark, that was a gold mine. They'd fill a sack until their backs creaked. Then they had to carry that sack out of the mud. That's where it got dangerous. A 50-pound bag of wet coal makes you heavy. You sink faster. If you stand still for more than a few seconds, the mud locks around your ankles. You try to pull one foot out, and the other one sinks deeper. You're trapped. And the Thames doesn't care if you're stuck. The tide comes back fast. It doesn't come back slow. It rushes. It swirls. You see a kid struggling, trying to pull his foot out, while the water starts licking his ankles. He doesn't drop the bag. He can't. If he drops the bag, he doesn't eat tomorrow. He keeps pulling. The water hits his knees, then his waist. If your foot is caught under a piece of sunken timber or a heavy rock, you don't get free. You just wait for the water to hit your chin, then your nose. No one is coming to help. The dock guards just watch from the piers. To them, you're just another piece of the river's trash. This wasn't a hobby. This was the city's recycling system. Before there were garbage trucks, there were these kids. They cleaned the river because they were hungry. They picked the bones of the empire. They didn't think they were doing something brave. They just knew that the tide went out, and that was their window to survive. If they missed it, they starved. If they got stuck, they drowned. It was that simple. They lived in the cracks of the city. They slept in cellars. They spent their days bent over, eyes glued to the ground. They weren't looking at the sky. They were looking at the filth. Not human ones, usually. Beef bones, mutton bones. They sold those to the button makers. Everything had a price. A rusty nail, a piece of lead, a scrap of canvas. If it could be burned, sold, or melted, they grabbed it. You could smell a mudlark from 3 blocks away. That smell stayed in their skin. It stayed in their hair. It was the collective waste of 2 million people. But that smell meant they had a chance. It meant they had been in the thick of it. They were shadows moving in the gray light. They grabbed what the rest of the world threw away. And while they were scraping the bottom of the river, other men were going even deeper. They weren't looking for coal on the surface. They were going into the brick tunnels where the sun never reached. Those men didn't just deal with the waste after it hit the river. They met it at the source.
You called them Toshers. They didn't mind the name. In the mid-1800s, being a Tosher meant you were at the top of the food chain in the London gutters. These guys were the kings of the dark. While everyone else was scraping by on the surface, the Toshers were heading underground. They weren't looking for coal or iron. They were looking for what the rich people dropped. Think about the street drains. Every time it rained, or every time a lady tripped on the cobblestones, things fell. Silver spoons, gold coins, copper nails, pieces of lead. All of it washed down those iron grates and ended up in the brick tunnels beneath the city. And that's where the Toshers lived. I want you to imagine a Friday night in London. You're standing over a heavy iron grate in the middle of a busy street. People are walking by. They don't look down. You wait for the gap in the crowd. Then you and your mates jam a crowbar into the slot. You heave. That iron plate weighs 100 pounds, but you slide it just enough. You drop through the hole. You slide down a slick brick wall, and your boots hit something soft. You don't ask what it is. You just know it's deep. You pull the grate shut above you. Now you're in their world. It's pitch black. You can't use a torch because you need your hands, so you strap a lantern to your chest. It's a small tin box with a candle inside. It throws just enough light to see 3 feet in front of your face. It smells like every toilet in London just emptied into your lungs, but you don't gag. You can't afford to gag. If you're gagging, you're not looking. You're carrying a long pole. They called it a hoe stick. It's got a big iron hook on the end. You don't walk through the sewer, you wade. The water is up to your knees, maybe your waist. It's moving, too. You take that hook and you drag it through the muck on the floor of the tunnel. You're listening. You aren't looking for the shine of gold. You won't see it in this filth. You're listening for the clink. Clink. That's the sound of a silver shilling hitting the hook. Clink. That's a brass buckle. When you hear it, you reach down. You shove your arm into the gray slush up to your shoulder. You grab whatever hit your metal hook. You wipe the grease off on your pants and you check it. If it's metal, it goes in the bag. If it's gold, it goes in your mouth. You keep it under your tongue so your partners don't see it. In the tunnels, even friends get greedy. The Toshers didn't work alone. That was the first rule. You went in groups of 3 or 4. If you went in alone, you didn't come out. The sewers weren't built like they are today. The brick was old. It crumbled. You'd be walking along and a wall would just give up. It would collapse and pin you in the mud. Without your mates to dig you out, you'd just stay there until the tide came in. And the tide was the real killer. The London sewers didn't just sit there. They emptied into the Thames. When the river rose, the water backed up into the tunnels. You'd be half a mile deep, scraping for coins, and then you'd hear it, a low roar, like a train coming through a tunnel.
That's the river coming back for its waste. If you heard that sound, you had about 2 minutes to find a ladder or a grate. If you didn't make it, the water hit the ceiling. You'd be trapped against the brick, gasping for air that isn't there, until the river filled your lungs. Then there was the gas. It's pocketed air that doesn't have any oxygen, or worse, it's methane from the rotting waste. You'd take a step, break a crust of sludge, and release a bubble of gas. If your candle flickered out, you knew the air was dead. You had to hold your breath and run back the way you came. If you stayed to relight the candle, you'd pass out and drown in 6 inches of water. If the gas was flammable, your lantern became a bomb. One spark and the whole tunnel turned into a furnace.
you'd be cooked alive before you could even scream. These guys had a whole secret language for this. They knew which tunnels led to the wealthy areas like Westminster. That's where the gold was. They knew which drains were connected to the butcher shops. You stayed away from those. The fat from the meat would clog the pipes and turn into solid white walls of grease. You'd get stuck in it like a fly in honey. They had a code of silence, too. You didn't tell the police where you went down. You didn't tell the neighbors why you had silver coins in your pocket when you didn't have a job. If a Tosher found a good spot, a honey hole where the coins piled up, he'd guard it. He'd mark the bricks with a secret scratch so his crew knew it was theirs. So why do it? Why crawl through human waste and risk being blown up or drowned? Because a good night in the sewer could pay more than a month at a factory. A factory worker might make a few shillings a week. A lucky Tosher could find a gold watch or a handful of silver spoons in a single hour. It was a gamble. You were betting your life against the things people dropped down the drain. Most of these men didn't live long. The sewer fever usually got them. Their skin would turn yellow, their sores wouldn't heal, and their lungs would give out. But as long as there was silver in the muck, there was a man willing to lift a grate and disappear into the dark. They were the only ones who knew what London was really made of. They saw the bottom of the world, and they made a living off the things we wanted to forget. They didn't just deal with the waste, they owned it. But as the Industrial Revolution picked up speed, the city started changing. The old brick tunnels weren't enough anymore. The waste was piling up faster than the Toshers could pick through it. The tunnels were getting tighter, the gas was getting thicker, and the great stink was about to force the city to build something even bigger. And in those new tunnels, there wouldn't be any room for scavengers. The age of the Tosher was coming to a close, but the jobs were only going to get weirder. So you climb out of the sewer, you're covered in grease, and you're looking for a fresh start. You think the sunlight is going to make things better. It doesn't, because the street level is just as filthy. It's just a different kind of filth. In the mid-1800s, London had a dog problem. There were hundreds of thousands of them. Strays, pets, working dogs, they were everywhere. And they all had one thing in common. They left a mess. To you or me, that's a nuisance. You step in it, you ruin your day. But to a specific group of people, that mess was a paycheck. We're talking about the Pure Finders. I know, the name sounds like they're out searching for something holy. They weren't. They were hunting for dog dung. I want you to imagine your morning. You don't have an alarm clock. You have the sound of wagon wheels on stone. You get up. You don't put on a suit. You put on your oldest rags. You grab a bucket, and you grab one very specific tool, a single black leather glove. You don't wear two. You can't afford to. You just need the one for your grabbing hand. You keep the other hand clean to carry your bucket or to fend off a rival. You spend the next 12 hours staring at the ground. You aren't looking for coins. You aren't looking for jewelry. That was the industry term. Why? Because it was used to purify leather. See, back then, London was the center of the world for leather. Gloves, boots, bookbindings, carriage seats. But there was a problem. To get the hair off an animal hide, you have to soak it in lime. That works, but it leaves the skin stiff, brittle. It feels like a piece of wood. You can't make a high-end lady's glove out of something that cracks when you bend it. The tanners needed a way to get that lime out. They needed something acidic, something that would break down the fibers and make the leather soft. They found out that dog poop did the trick better than anything else on earth. It was a chemical reaction. The enzymes in the waste ate the lime. It left the leather supple, smooth, expensive. So the so what here is simple. If you wanted to look like a gentleman, you needed a pure finder to spend his day in the gutter. No poop, no fashion. No fashion, no industry. The pure finder's life was a game of speed. You'd walk miles, you'd follow the dogs, you'd wait for them to finish their business, and you had to be fast. If you weren't, someone else would beat you to it. I'm talking about old women, young kids, and grown men all diving for the same pile of waste. They'd fight over it. They'd trade blows over a street corner, because a full bucket meant you got to eat. An empty bucket meant you went hungry. And there was a hierarchy to it. Not all dung was created equal. Whiters, that was the stuff from dogs that had been chewing on bones. It was dry, it was chalky, it had a higher lime neutralizing power. That stuff fetched the highest price. If you found a pile of the white stuff, you didn't just toss it in the bucket, you treated it like a diamond. You kept it separate. Think about the physical toll. You're hunched over all day. Your back stays bent. You're breathing in the fumes of a city that doesn't have a trash service. You're scooping up waste with a gloved hand and putting it in a bucket that you carry on your hip. By noon, that bucket is heavy. It's sloshing, and you're covered in it. It's in your pores. It's in your hair. Then comes the payday. You walk your bucket down to the Bermondsey district. That was the heart of the tanning trade. You'd smell it before you saw it, a mix of rotting flesh and chemicals. You'd walk up to the tannery gates and wait in line with the others. The tanner would look at your haul. He'd weigh it. He'd poke it with a stick to make sure you hadn't padded the weight with stones or mud. If it was good, he'd pay you by the pound. On a good day, you might make a shilling. That's about 12 pence. To put that in perspective, a loaf of bread was about 2 pence. A pint of beer was a penny. You weren't getting rich. You were staying alive for one more day. But here's the kicker. Because the work was so disgusting, people assumed the pure finders were the lowest of the low. They were invisible. They were the ghosts of the street. But they knew something the rich people didn't. They knew that the entire economy of the city was built on what people wanted to ignore. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about high-tech steam engines and giant factories. It was about the hand in the gutter. It was about the guy with the black glove making sure a rich man's boots didn't squeak. Every time a carriage door opened and a lady stepped out in soft leather shoes, she was walking on the work of a pure finder. They kept the streets clean because the city couldn't. They recycled the waste because the factories needed it. They were the human filters of the Victorian era. It was a brutal, smelly, desperate way to live, but if they stopped walking, the leather trade died. And if the leather trade died, thousands of people lost their jobs. The competition got even crazier as the years went on. You started seeing people farming dogs just for the pure. They'd keep dozens of strays in a basement, feeding them bones just to collect the white droppings. It was an ecosystem of waste. You'd see an old woman who had worked the same 3 blocks for 30 years. She knew every dog by name. She knew their schedules. She'd wait at the corner of a pub at 8 a.m. because she knew the butcher's dog would be out then. That was her territory. You step on that territory, you're looking for a fight. She'd use her bucket as a weapon. She had to. That street corner was her life insurance policy. This wasn't just a job. It was a war of the senses. You stopped smelling the filth after the first week. You stopped feeling the shame after the first month. You just saw the world in terms of weight and value. You saw a dog. You saw a potential meal. You saw a rival. You saw a threat. The city kept growing. The buildings got taller. The machines got louder. But at the bottom of it all, in the shadows of the big factories, there was a man with a bucket. He was stooped over. He was looking at the ground.
He was waiting for a dog to lift its tail.
Because in the middle of the greatest industrial expansion in human history, someone still had to pick up the mess, and as long as there was leather to be made, there was money to be found in the dirt. It tells you everything you need to know about that time. We remember the kings and the inventors. We remember the guys who built the bridges. But the whole thing stayed upright because of the people who were willing to do the things no one else would touch. They didn't have a choice. They had a bucket, a glove, and a hunger that wouldn't go away. So next time you see a pair of old leather gloves in a museum, don't just look at the stitching. Think about how they got that soft. Think about the person who spent 14 hours a day in the mud to make it happen. They didn't do it for the glory. They did it so they wouldn't starve. That was the real engine of the 19th century. Not steam, not coal, just pure, desperate hustle. Think about the last time you felt a fever. You probably reached for an aspirin, maybe a glass of water. In the 1800s, the doctor reached for a box of worms. Back then, medical science was obsessed with one thing: blood. They thought you had too much of it, so they had to get it out of you. They called it bloodletting. It was the cure for everything: headaches, broken bones, even the plague. This created a massive problem. Doctors needed a way to drain you without just cutting your throat. They needed a tool that was precise, something that could suck the poison out without making a mess. They needed the leech. The demand was insane. We're talking millions of worms every year. France alone was importing 40 million of them. Someone had to go get them. And those people weren't scientists. They weren't doctors. They were the poorest people in the country, women and children who lived in the marshes. They didn't have nets. They didn't have traps. They didn't have money for equipment. All they had was their own skin. Picture this. You're standing on the edge of a bog. The water is green. It's thick with rotting plants and dead fish. You don't have boots. You're barefoot. You're wearing a ragged skirt. You don't look for the leeches with your eyes. You look for them with your legs. You walk right into the muck. You push through the reeds. You want to make some noise. You want to stir up the bottom. You want to send out ripples. To a leech, that vibration sounds like dinner. They think a horse or a cow just stepped into their world. They're hungry, and you're the biggest meal they've seen in months. You don't feel the bite. That's the trick. A leech has 3 jaws. Each jaw has about 100 teeth. They don't just poke you. They saw into you. They pump you full of a special spit that numbs the skin. You're standing in that waist-deep water, and you feel a tiny tickle, like a blade of grass brushing your calf. Then another, then 5 more. You just stand there. You have to. If you move too fast, they might drop off. You need them to lock on. While you're standing there, the leech is working. It's pumping a chemical called hiridin into your veins. It thins your blood. It keeps the wound from clotting. The leech starts out thin. It looks like a little scrap of black ribbon. Then it starts to grow. It drinks. It swells. You can feel the weight of them now. They're getting heavy. They're turning into fat, slimy sausages hanging off your skin. After 20 minutes, you wade back to the shore. You look down at your legs. You don't see skin. You see a cluster of black, wriggling bodies. They're bloated. They're shiny with your own blood. Now you have to get them off. You don't just rip them. If you pull too hard, those 300 teeth stay inside your leg. They rot. They turn into sores that never heal. So you peel them. You use your fingernails to break the seal at the mouth. You drop the fat worms into a jar.
But here's the thing. The bleeding doesn't stop. Remember that chemical they pumped into you? It's still working. You walk home, and your legs are literally leaking. You're leaving a red trail in the dirt. You wrap your legs in old rags, but the blood soaks through in minutes. You're losing more blood than the leeches actually took. You do this every day. You go back into the pond because you need the pennies the pharmacist pays. But there's a price. You start getting pale. Your breath gets short. You can't climb a hill without your heart hammering against your ribs. You're becoming a ghost. You're literally draining your life into a glass jar so some rich guy in the city can try to cure his gout. And then there are the infections. That swamp water isn't clean. It's a soup of bacteria. Every time a leech saws into your leg, it opens a door. The pond water rushes in. Your legs start to swell. They turn red, then purple, then black. You get ulcers that eat deep into the muscle. You see women in these villages with legs that look like raw meat. They're limping. They're scarred. Some of them lose the ability to walk entirely. If you were lucky, you'd catch enough leeches to buy a loaf of bread. If you weren't, you'd catch a fever from the very water you were standing in. The doctors used those leeches to cure the sick, but the women who caught them were the ones who actually paid the bill. They traded their blood for a few coins. They traded their health so a pharmacist could stock his shelves. It wasn't about building a business, it was about survival. You offered your body as bait because you didn't have anything else to give. You stood in the cold mud and let worms eat you alive so your kids wouldn't starve. Eventually, the fad died out. Doctors realized that draining a patient's blood usually just killed them faster. The demand for leeches dropped. The ponds went quiet. But for decades, the backbone of the medical industry wasn't a pill or a syringe. It was the legs of a woman standing in a swamp, waiting for something to bite. She didn't do it for the glory of science. She did it because the mud was the only place left to make a living. And in the 19th century, that was the only rule that mattered. You worked until you bled, and then you worked some more. Look, the mud wasn't the worst of it. Not even close. If you lived in London or New York back then, the real nightmare lived right under your feet. Literally, right beneath your floorboards. Think about your bathroom for a second. You hit a lever, you hear a whistle. The water takes it away. But back in the 1800s, there was no away. There was just down. Every house had a hole. They called it a cesspool. It was basically a big brick box built into the dirt of your basement. No pipes, no drains, just a pit. You used a bucket upstairs, you walked down, and you dumped it, day after day, week after week. Now think about a city like London, millions of people, every single one of them filling up a hole in their basement. Eventually, that hole gets full. It doesn't just stop, it starts to leak. The liquid soaks into the bricks. It turns the dirt around your house into a swamp of human waste. The smell didn't just drift through the house. It lived there. It was part of the furniture. If you didn't do something about it, the floor would eventually just turn into a pond of filth. But you couldn't just hire a guy to fix it at noon. The city wouldn't let you. It was against the law to move that stuff during the day. If you tried to haul a cart of waste through the streets at 3 in the afternoon, the cops would throw you in a cell. The smell would shut down the entire neighborhood.
so everything happened in the dark. That's where the night soil men come in. These guys were the shadows of the industrial world. They didn't start work until the clock hit midnight. When everyone else was tucked in, these guys were just getting their boots on. They worked in small teams, usually 4 of them. They had a horse, a wooden cart, and a couple of buckets. They didn't knock on the front door. They didn't want to wake you up. They'd find the little coal hatch or the cellar window. They'd crawl inside. They worked by the light of a single candle. If the candle flickered out, it meant the air was bad. It meant there wasn't enough oxygen to keep the flame alive. And if the flame died, you were next. One guy had the worst job. He was the hole man. He'd climb down into the pit. He didn't have boots that went to his waist. He just had his old clothes. He'd drop down into the sludge. Sometimes it was up to his chest. He'd stand there in the dark, breathing in those fumes, and he'd start shoveling. He had a short shovel. A big one wouldn't work in the tight space. He'd fill a bucket. He'd lift it over his head. The next guy, the rope man, would grab it and pull it up. Then he'd hand it to the tub man. This guy carried the bucket through the basement, out the window, and across the sidewalk. Think about that walk. You're carrying a 40-pound bucket of liquid waste. One slip and you're covered. The sidewalk is slick. The stairs are narrow. You do this 100 times in a single night. Your back screams. Your lungs burn. But you don't stop, because if the sun comes up and that cart isn't gone, you don't get paid. And then there was the air. That's the thing that really killed them. We call it methane now. They just called it the breath of the pit. It's a gas that builds up when things rot. It's heavy. It stays at the bottom. The hole man would be shoveling away, feeling fine, and then he'd take one wrong breath. His brain would just shut off. He'd tip over. If his partners were fast, they'd hook him and pull him out. If they weren't, he drowned. It happened all the time. You'd read about it in the papers. A man goes into a cellar and never comes out. Or worse, sometimes they'd bring a lantern too close to the edge. The gas would catch a spark. The whole pit would turn into a bomb. It would blow the windows out of the house and kill everyone in the basement instantly. But the danger didn't end with the gas. These pits were built by the lowest bidder. The bricks were cheap. The mortar was weak. When you scoop out all that weight from the inside, the pressure from the outside dirt pushes in. If those walls weren't braced right, they'd just snap. Thousands of pounds of wet earth would cave in. You'd be pinned against the back wall and buried before you could even scream. So why did they do it? Why risk a death like that? Money, plain and simple. This was some of the highest-paying manual labor in the city. You could make more in a night than a factory worker made in a week, because nobody else would touch the job. You were an outcast. You smelled so bad the skin on your hands would turn yellow. You couldn't go to a normal church. You couldn't sit in a theater. You were marked. But there was a second way to get paid. The night soil itself. See, this wasn't just trash. To a farmer 10 miles outside the city, this was gold. Chemical fertilizers didn't exist yet. If you wanted to grow enough food to feed a city of 3 million, you needed help. You needed nitrogen. And the night soil men had plenty of it. Once the cart was full, they'd drive it out. They'd leave the city gates just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. They'd head for the countryside. The farmers would pay them for every load. They'd dump the carts into big trenches in the fields. They'd mix it with straw and let it sit. That's the loop. You eat a potato in a London flat. You dump the waste in a hole. The night soil man digs it out at 2 in the morning.
He drives it to a farm. The farmer uses it to grow more potatoes. Those potatoes go back to the market. You buy one. The cycle starts again. Without these guys, the whole system breaks. The city would have choked on its own filth in a month. People would have died by the thousands from cholera and typhoid. And they did, eventually, because there weren't enough night soil men to keep up. The pits overflowed. The basements turned into swamps. But for a few decades, these men were the only thing keeping the city upright. They were the ones who kept the plague at bay. They did the work that nobody wanted to acknowledge. They lived in the dark. They died in the dark. And they did it all for a few extra coins and a bottle of gin to numb the senses. It was a brutal way to live.
But in a world where the only other option was starving in the street, a lot of men chose the pit. They'd rather be covered in filth than have an empty stomach. They worked until their bodies gave out. They worked until the fumes got them. And then another guy would step up and grab the shovel. Because as long as there are people living in a city, there's going to be a hole that needs emptying. And as long as there's a hole, there's going to be a man willing to climb into it for the right price. That was the law of the 19th century. You found a way to be useful, or you disappeared. The night soil men didn't disappear. They were just hidden. They were the engine under the floorboards. They were the reason the streets didn't swallow the houses whole. But as the city grew, the pits got bigger. The work got harder. The smell got worse. Pretty soon, the night wasn't long enough to finish the job. The city was drowning in itself, and even the toughest men with the biggest shovels couldn't hold back the tide anymore. They needed a new way to deal with the mess. They needed someone to go even deeper. They needed the men who lived in the pipes. But those sewer pipes were big. You could stand up in some of them. You could breathe, even if the air smelled like a grave. But as the city grew up, it also grew tall. Rich people wanted a fireplace in every single room. They wanted warmth, but they didn't want to see the smoke. So they built houses with dozens of chimneys. These weren't the big square chimneys you see in cartoons. These were flues, narrow, twisting stone tubes that snaked through the walls. Some were barely 14 inches wide. That's about the size of a large pizza box. The men in the sewers had it bad, but they were men. They had muscle. They had a choice, mostly. The people needed to clean these new, narrow chimneys couldn't be men. A man's shoulders would wedge tight before he even got his waist inside. To keep these houses from burning down, the city needed something smaller, something disposable. They needed children. This is where the master sweep comes in. Think of him like a contractor, but he's not buying tools, he's buying people. He goes to the local orphanage. He looks for the kids who are small for their age, the ones who look like they haven't had a meal in a week. He hands the warden a few shillings and walks out with a 4-year-old boy. On paper, it's an apprenticeship. In reality, that master sweep just bought a human brush. He takes the boy back to the shop. He doesn't give him a uniform. He doesn't give him shoes. He tells the boy to strip everything off. You go into the chimney naked. Why? Because cloth bunches up. A shirt sleeve catches on a jagged brick and you're stuck. A pant leg hooks on a nail and you're dead. Naked skin slides better. That's the logic. The boy looks up into a black hole. It's dark. It's cold. It smells like old ash and burnt fat. The master sweep points up and tells him to climb. The boy doesn't have a ladder. He doesn't have a rope. He has to use his own body to fight gravity. He jams his elbows into the soot-covered brick on one side. He kicks his knees out against the other. He presses his back against the wall. Then he shimmies.
Imagine doing that for 60 feet. You're horizontal, then you're vertical, then you hit a bend. The chimney turns at a sharp angle. You have to suck in your gut, reach around the corner, and find a grip on a brick you can't see. Your skin scrapes against the rough stone. Every move tears a little more flesh off your knees and elbows. The soot gets into the raw wounds. It stings like acid. The master sweep stands at the bottom. If the boy slows down, the master doesn't shout encouragement. He lights a small fire in the hearth. He wants the boy to feel the heat on his heels. It's a simple choice: climb faster or get smold. Sometimes the master takes a long pin and pokes at the boy's feet from below. He treats the kid like an animal, because to him, that's all the kid is. The soot is the real killer. It's not just dust. It's heavy. It's thick. As the boy brushes the walls, the soot falls down on top of him. It fills his eyes. It plugs his nose. He has to breathe, so he inhales the black powder. It coats his throat like wet cement.
He's coughing, he's choking, and he's trying to stay pinned to the walls so he doesn't slide back down and break his neck. That's when a boy gets to a tight spot and panics. He takes a deep, sharp breath. His chest expands. Now he's an inch wider than the pipe. He's wedged. He can't move his arms to push off. He can't move his legs to kick. He's trapped in a vertical stone coffin. If he can't calm down and breathe out, he stays there. When a boy got stuck, they didn't call the fire department. There wasn't one. The master sweep might try to pull him down by the legs, but that usually just tore the boy's joints apart. If they couldn't get him out, they'd have to break the wall of the house from the outside. That cost money. Most homeowners didn't want to pay for a broken wall just to save a nameless orphan. Sometimes they just left them. They'd wall the chimney up, and the boy would stay there forever. If the boy survived the climb, he didn't get a bath. He didn't get a bed. He'd come down covered in black grime from head to toe. His elbows and knees would be bleeding. The master sweep had a trick for that. He'd take the boy to a tub of strong brine, salty water. He'd toss the boy in. The salt would scream into those open cuts. It was agony. But the master knew that after a few weeks of this, the skin would turn into thick, hard scabs, leather. Once the boy had leather skin, he could work longer. He could climb harder. He was more valuable. The boys lived on the soot they collected. No, they didn't eat it. They slept on it. They'd fill large bags with the ash from the chimneys and pile them in a cellar. That was their mattress. They breathed that dust 24 hours a day. It stayed in their hair. It stayed under their fingernails. They were walking shadows. But the job didn't just hurt while they were in the pipe. It changed their bodies. Their spines grew crooked from being bent in those narrow flues. Their legs stayed bowed. All that soot, all that coal dust, it would get trapped in the folds of their skin. It stayed there for years. It caused tumors that would eat them alive by the time they hit their teens. Most of these kids never saw 20. If they grew too big to fit in the pipes, they were tossed out. But they were deformed. They were sick. They didn't have a trade. They only knew the inside of a chimney. The city stayed warm. The rich people sat by their clean fires and read their books. They didn't think about the 6-year-old who bled all over the bricks inside their walls to make that fire possible. They didn't think about the kid who was breathing in the smoke from the bottom while he scraped the top. You have to understand the scale of this. This wasn't 1 or 2 kids. This was thousands. Every house in London, every factory, every bakery needed these boys. The Industrial Revolution didn't just run on coal and steam. It ran on the skin and bone of children who were small enough to fit where the sun didn't shine.
The sewers were a mess, sure, but at least down there you were fighting the waste of the city. In the chimneys, you were fighting the house itself.
You were fighting a brick throat that wanted to swallow you whole, and the only thing keeping you moving was the sting of a pin or the heat of a flame on your feet. The people at the top of the social ladder liked to talk about progress. They liked to talk about how the world was changing. But they never looked up the flue. They never looked at the black handprints on the wallpaper. They didn't want to know that their comfort was built on a foundation of terrified children holding their breath in the dark. So next time you look at an old brick building, don't just see the architecture. Don't just see the history. Look at the chimneys. Think about a 14-inch gap. Think about being naked and covered in salt. Think about the shimmy. Every one of those bricks has a story, and most of them were written in the soot by a kid who just wanted to breathe. The city was growing. It was getting richer. It was getting faster. But it was doing it by chewing up its youngest. They were the human alarms, the human brushes, and the human filters. They were the ones who kept the fires burning, even if it meant they never got to feel the warmth themselves. They lived in the dark, so the rest of the world could see. And when they got too big, or too sick, or too stuck, the city just found another orphan and handed over a few more shillings. The fire had to keep burning. The smoke had to go somewhere. And as long as there were chimneys, there would be boys to climb them. But it wasn't just the boys in the soot. Down the street, inside those massive brick boxes they called factories, thousands of girls were busy lighting the fires that made that smoke. You've used a match today. You struck it, it lit, you threw it away. You didn't think about it. In the 1880s, nobody thought about it either. But the people making those matches, they couldn't think about anything else. Walk into a match factory in East London. It's not a room, it's a cage. You've got 14 hours ahead of you. You're 13 years old. You stand on a wooden crate because you're too short to reach the bench, and you start dipping. You take a frame, it holds hundreds of tiny wooden splints. You dunk the ends into a vat of warm, thick paste. This stuff is white phosphorus. It looks like cream. It smells like a mix of garlic and rotting fish. It stays in your nose. It gets under your fingernails. It coats your skin. You do this over and over. Dunk, lift, move. Dunk, lift, move. You do it for 6 hours, then 8, then 12. Your legs aren't legs anymore. They're just two poles of pulsing pain. If you sit down, a foreman shouts. If you talk to the girl next to you, they fine you. If you drop a frame and the matches catch fire, they take half your week's pay. So you keep standing. You keep dipping. Now look at the air. The room is full of a fine white mist. That's the phosphorus vapor. You're breathing it in with every breath. You don't have a mask. You don't have a vent. You just have your lungs. It settles on your teeth. It soaks into your gums. And here is the kicker. You don't get a lunch break in a clean room. You eat right there. You grab a piece of bread with hands covered in that white paste. You swallow the poison with your lunch because you have no choice. You're hungry. You eat. You work. The bosses know this stuff is toxic. They aren't stupid. They know there's a safer version called red phosphorus, but red phosphorus costs more. It eats into the profit margins, so they stick with the white stuff.
They tell you to wash your hands. They give you a bucket of cold water for 500 girls. It does nothing. After a few months of this, it starts. It begins with a toothache, just a dull throb in the back of your mouth. You try to ignore it. You need the shillings, but the throb becomes a roar. Your gums start to swell. They turn a weird, angry purple. Then they turn green. Small holes open in your jaw. Abscesses form. They leak a foul yellow pus that smells so bad your own family won't sit at the table with you. You try to cover your face with a rag, but the smell cuts right through it. This is Phossy Jaw, and it's not just a toothache. The phosphorus is literally eating your bone while you're still alive. It works like an acid. It gets into the jawbone and tells the cells to stop living. The bone starts to rot. It turns porous like a piece of pumice stone. Here is the part that will keep you up at night. At night, in the dark of your bedroom, your jaw glows. If you look in a mirror, your mouth emits a faint, ghostly green light.
The poison is so concentrated in your face that it glows in the dark. You're a walking lantern of your own destruction. By now, the pain is so bad you can't eat, you can't sleep. You go to the factory boss, you show him your swollen face. You know what he does? He fires you. He doesn't give you a pension. He doesn't pay for a doctor. He kicks you out onto the street because a girl with a rotting face scares the other workers. And he replaces you in 5 minutes. There's a line of orphans at the gate waiting for your spot. You go to a hospital. They don't have antibiotics. They don't have fancy scanners. The surgeon looks at you and sighs. He knows what he has to do. He takes a saw. He doesn't have gas to put you under because that's too expensive for a factory girl. He pins you down. He cuts your gums open, and he saws out your entire jawbone. He pulls the rotted, glowing bone out of your head. If you're lucky, you survive the infection, but you're disfigured for life. Your face collapses in on itself. You can't chew. You can hardly speak. You're 20 years old, and you look like a monster. All because the company wanted to save a few pennies on the chemical mix. The owners of these factories, they were the pillars of the community. They gave money to churches. They sat on boards. They went home to big houses in the suburbs where the air was clean. They knew the girls were dying. They had reports. They saw the women with the missing jaws. But they looked at the ledgers, and they looked at the dividends, and they decided the glow was worth the gold. You'd think the government would step in, but the match industry was big business. They had lobbyists. They said it was a hygiene problem. They blamed the victims for not washing enough in that one bucket of cold water. So the girls kept dipping. They kept breathing the mist. They kept eating the bread. Every time a match struck a box and a flame flickered to life, it was paid for in bone. The price of a cheap light was a girl's face, and the factory gates just kept swinging open, swallowing the healthy and spitting out the broken. The machine didn't care about the meat. It only cared about the matches. The fire had to keep burning. The world wanted light, and if a few thousand girls had to glow in the dark before they died, that was just the cost of doing business. You hold a match in your hand, and it's light as a feather, but in the 1800s, that little stick of wood weighed more than a human life. It was a trade, a jaw for a box of matches, and the bosses made that trade every single day without blinking an eye. They didn't see people. They saw units of production. They saw frames to be dicked and boxes to be packed. If a unit broke, you threw it away. You didn't fix it, you didn't mourn it, you just reached into the pile and grabbed another one, because there was always another one. There was always another girl hungry enough to risk the rot for a piece of bread. And as long as that stayed true, the vats of white phosphorus stayed full, and the air in the factory stayed thick with the smell of garlic and death.
But garlic wasn't the only smell in the slums, not by a long shot. You move away from the match factories and head down the alleyways where the sun never hits the cobblestones. You stop, you listen, you hear it behind the brickwork, a dry scratching, a rustling under the floorboards. It's the sound of a city being eaten alive from the inside out. London was losing a war. The enemy was the brown rat. They didn't just scurry, they took over. They ate through lead pipes. They chewed through thick oak doors. They bid babies in their cribs and stole food off the tables of people who already had nothing. They carried the plague, they carried typhus, and they carried a mean streak that made them stand their ground and hiss when you tried to shoo them away. This is where the rat catcher comes in. He didn't wear a fancy uniform. He didn't have a college degree. He wore a heavy leather coat, usually thick with grease and grime. He needed that leather because it was the only thing standing between his skin and a mouthful of jagged yellow teeth. He carried a cage, a bag of ferrets, and a scruffy terrier that looked like it had been run over by a carriage and lived to tell the tale. The job was simple. A landlord or a shopkeeper realized their grain was disappearing or their cellar was floor deep in droppings. They called the man. He showed up at midnight because that's when the rats feel like they own the world. He didn't use poison. Poison was expensive, and it made the rats crawl into the walls to die. Then you'd have to live with the smell of rotting meat for a month. Nah, the rat catcher used teeth. He starts with the ferret. You shove the ferret down the hole. It's a heat-seeking missile with a spine like a slinky. It crawls into the dark, into the nests where the rats sleep. The rats smell the predator. They panic. They can't fight a ferret in a tight tunnel, so they bolt. They run right out of the wall and into the open room. That's when the dog earns his keep. A good ratting terrier doesn't bark. Barking scares the prey back into the hole. The dog just waits. He watches the floor. The second a rat hits the boards, the dog snaps. One hard shake of the head. Snap. The neck is broken before the rat can even squeak. The dog tosses the carcass aside and resets. He doesn't eat them. He doesn't play with them. He's a machine. A good dog could clear a cellar in 20 minutes. You'd end up with a pile of fur and tails 3 feet high. But here's the thing about the Victorian era. Everyone had a side hustle. If the rat catcher just killed the rats, he got a few pennies from the landlord. That's bread money. That's not get-ahead money. So, if he was smart, he didn't let the dog kill everything. He'd wait for a big, healthy rat to bolt. He'd reach out with a pair of iron tongs or his bare hands if he was feeling lucky and grab it by the tail. He'd swing it into a deep canvas bag. You'd hear them in there, hundreds of them, screaming, fighting each other, biting at the fabric. He'd walk home with that bag over his shoulder, feeling the teeth napping at his spine through the leather. Why keep them alive? Because of the pubs, specifically the rat and terrier pubs. Follow the money. It goes from the gutter to the back room of a tavern. There's a wooden ring set up in the center of the floor. It's about
8 feet across with high walls so nothing can get out. They dump the sand on the floor to soak up the blood. Men are standing around the edge with thick wads of cash. These are the rich guys, men in top hats and silk waistcoats. They've come down from the nice parts of town to watch something ugly. The rat catcher shows up with his bag. He dumps 50, maybe 100 live rats into that pit. It's a carpet of gray fur and twitching whiskers. They're terrified. They try to climb the walls. They huddle in the corners. Then the bookie starts taking bets. They drop in a dog, usually a tiny bull terrier. They start the stopwatch. You're betting on time. How many seconds does it take for this dog to kill every single thing in that ring? It's not a fight. It's a slaughter. The dog goes to work. He's getting bit. The rats climb his legs. They hang off his ears. They sink their teeth into his jowls. But the dog doesn't stop. He can't stop. If he stops, his owner loses a fortune. The crowd is screaming. The air gets thick with the smell of wet fur and iron. There was a dog back then named Billy. He was a legend. In 1823, they put him in a pit with 100 rats. He killed them all in 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Do the math. That's a kill every 3 seconds. That's what the rich men paid to see. It was a cycle. The city grew bigger and filthier every day. The sewers were overflowing. The trash was piled high in the streets. That meant the rats ate better than the people did. And as long as the rats were fat and plentiful, the rat catcher stayed in business. He was the only man in London who looked at a pile of rotting garbage and saw a gold mine. He didn't want the city to get clean. He didn't want the sewers to get fixed. If the city got healthy, he'd have to go back to the match factory. He'd have to go back to the garlic smell and the rotting jawbones. So he kept his ferrets hungry, he kept his dogs sharp, and he kept his eyes on the floor. Every scratch in the wall was a paycheck. Every bite on his hand was just the cost of doing business. In the Industrial Revolution, you either hunted or you were the one getting eaten. And the rat catcher, he preferred to be the one holding the bag. He'd finish his night at the pub, watch the blood get swept out of the pit, and head back into the fog. There was always another cellar. There was always another nest. As long as London stayed dark and dirty, he was the king of the alleyways. And the rats, they just kept breeding. They kept the pits full, they kept the bets moving, and they kept the rat catcher from starving in the shadow of the very factories that were trying to kill everyone else. But the rats didn't care about the river. They thrived in it. You have to understand what the Thames was back then. It wasn't a river, not really. It was a 300-mile-long toilet. 3 million people lived in London by the middle of the 1800s. Every single one of them ate. Every one of them drank. And every one of them produced waste. In the old days, that waste went into a hole in the ground called a cesspit. But those holes were overflowing. They leaked into the basements. They seeped into the drinking wells. So the city made a choice. They linked the house drains to the street gutters. The gutters emptied into the river. Problem solved, right? Wrong. They just moved the filth from under their floorboards to their front door. By 1858, the Thames was a thick, black soup. It wasn't just human waste. It was offal from the slaughterhouses. It was chemicals from the factories. It was dead dogs and old shoes. The tide would come in and push all that sludge back up the pipes. Then the tide would go out and leave a coating of slime on the banks. It stayed like that for years. People got used to the smell. They called it the London fog, even when the sun was out. But then the weather changed. June 1858 hit London like a hammer. The sun didn't just shine, It baked. The temperature in the city climbed into the 90s and stayed there for weeks. The river started to shrink. As the water level dropped, the mud was exposed to the direct heat of the sun. But it wasn't mud. It was mounds of rotting, fermenting sewage. The sun literally cooked it. Imagine a giant pot of the worst thing you can think of sitting on a stove for a month. That was London. They called it the Great Stink, but that's a nice name for something that was actually a physical assault. It wasn't a bad smell you could ignore. It was a wall. It hit you in the throat. You didn't just smell it, you tasted it. People blocks away from the water started vomiting in the streets. They fainted while they were walking to work. Business stopped. Travelers took one look at the city and turned their horses around. The city was choking on its own lungs. Now, for years, the people in charge didn't do a thing. The politicians in Parliament were the kings of making excuses. They said it cost too much. They said the science wasn't clear. They sat in their big offices and looked the other way while the poor died of cholera in the slums. But they made one big mistake. They built the Houses of Parliament right on the bank of the Thames. They were sitting on the very edge of the most disgusting place on earth. By mid-June, the smell crawled through the windows of the government buildings. The politicians tried to fight back. They didn't want to leave their seats of power, so they came up with a plan. They took the heavy curtains in the committee rooms and soaked them in chloride of lime. They thought the chemicals would neutralize the stench. It failed. The smell cut through the lime like it wasn't even there. I want you to picture this. You have the most powerful men in the British Empire. They're wearing their top hats and their fine wool suits. They're trying to debate the laws of the land, and they're all gagging. They're holding silk handkerchiefs over their faces.
Their eyes are watering. One afternoon, a group of lawmakers tried to hold a meeting. They lasted less than 5 minutes. One of them stood up, grabbed his papers, and ran for the door. Within days, they weren't just ending meetings, they were fleeing the city. They jumped into carriages and ordered the drivers to get them as far away from the river as possible. That was the so what moment. You see, you can ignore the poor, you can ignore the sick, but you can't ignore it when you can't breathe in your own office. Suddenly, the money appeared. The excuses stopped. In just 18 days, they passed a law that had been stuck in the mud for a decade. They didn't just give the project the green light, they threw the entire bank at it. They turned to a man named Joseph Bazalgette. He was an engineer who didn't care about politics. He cared about flow. He had a plan to dig London out of its own filth, and now he finally had the cash to do it. He didn't just want to patch the holes. He wanted to rebuild the city from the bottom up. Bazalgette started an army. He hired thousands of men. They didn't have power tools. They had shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows. They started digging. They didn't just dig a few pipes. They built a massive underground world. We're talking 82 miles of main intercepting sewers. These weren't small tubes. These were massive brick tunnels, tall enough for a man to stand in. And they didn't stop there. They built over 1,000 miles of smaller street sewers to feed into the big ones. Think about the scale. They used 318 million bricks. Every single one of those bricks was laid by hand. They had to dig through the muck and the old graves and the forgotten basements of London. They built huge embankments along the river to trap the water and hide the pipes. They installed massive steam engines, the biggest in the world, just to pump the waste away from the city and out toward the sea. This wasn't just a construction project. It was an execution. It killed the old way of life. For centuries, the city relied on the bottom feeders to stay clean. Think about the night soil men.
They were the guys who spent their lives scooping out cesspits with buckets in the middle of the night. It was a dirty job, but it was a steady living. They sold that waste to farmers as fertilizer. But as Bazalgette's pipes reached every house, the cesspits were filled in with dirt. The night soil men woke up one morning and realized their trade was dead. The sewers did for free what they used to charge for. They were out of a job, replaced by brick and gravity. Then there were the Toshers. These were the scavengers who waded through the old crumbling drains. They looked for dropped coins, bits of silver, or scrap metal that washed down from the streets. It was dangerous, disgusting work, but they were their own bosses. Bazalgette's new sewers changed the game. These new tunnels were smooth. They were built for speed. The water moved so fast that nothing got stuck. There were no piles of silt to sift through. Plus, the city started locking the entrances. They put iron grates over the holes. They didn't want people down there anymore. The Toshers were pushed out. The shore workers, who knew every inch of the city's underbelly, were suddenly trespassers. Progress is a funny thing. It saves lives. It stopped the cholera. It cleared the air so people could finally breathe again without gagging. But it also wiped out a whole class of workers. The grittiest, toughest, most desperate jobs in history simply vanished into the pipes. The city grew up. It went underground. It became modern. And in the process, it left the scavengers and the scoopers behind in the dirt. They were the ones who kept the city running when no one else would touch the filth. Now the city didn't need them anymore. The era of the human alarm and the poop scooper was ending. The machines and the brickwork took over, and London finally, for the first time in 1,000 years, stopped smelling like a grave. London didn't just wake up one morning and decide to be clean. It didn't happen because people got soft or because they suddenly started caring about the poor. It happened because the math changed. The era of the human alarm and the poop scooper was ending. The machines and the brickwork took over. And London, finally, for the first time in 1,000 years, stopped smelling like a grave. You have to understand how fast this hit. One day, you're the most important guy on the block because you've got a long bamboo pole and the lungs to yell. You're the knocker-upper. You're the reason the factory starts on time. You walk the streets at 4 in the morning, banging on bedroom windows, making sure the gears of the empire keep turning. Then the factories start cranking out these little metal boxes, alarm clocks. At first, they're a luxury. Only the guys in the big houses have them. But then mass production kicks in. The price drops through the floor. Suddenly, a clock costs less than a week's rent. Why pay a man every morning when you can buy a spring and a bell once? The knocker-uppers didn't get a gold watch and a pension. They just found their poles were useless. They stayed in bed because nobody was paying them to be up. The machine did it for free, and it didn't need to stop for a drink. Then you've got the pure finders. Think about that job. You're spent your whole life bent over in the mud, picking up dog poop because the tanneries need the acid to soften leather. It's disgusting, but it's a living. You're a part of the cycle. But then a chemist in a lab somewhere figures out how to use chromium salts. It's a clean powder. It doesn't smell. More importantly, it works every single time, exactly the same way. You don't have to worry about what the dog ate. So the tanneries stop buying buckets of waste from old women on the street. They buy bags of chemicals from a warehouse. Just like that, the pure isn't worth a penny. The people who did that job didn't go back to school. They just disappeared into the slums. The leather got better, the streets stayed slightly cleaner, and the people who survived on the city's waste simply ran out of things to find. It wasn't just the tech, though. Sometimes the world changed because people finally had enough of the dying. Take the Matchgirls. This is 1888. These girls are working 14-hour days for pennies, and they're doing it while breathing in white phosphorus. It's a poison. It gets into your gums. It makes your teeth fall out. It literally rots your jawbone while you're still alive. It glows in the dark, for God's sakes. They called it Phossy Jaw. The bosses at the Bryant and May factory knew it was happening. They didn't care. It was cheaper to replace a girl than to fix the process. But then the girls walked out. 1,400 of them just dropped their frames and marched. They didn't just ask for a raise. They demanded the poison stop. They stood in the street, and they forced the public to look at their faces. And it worked. They didn't just win a strike. They forced a shift in the law. The government eventually had to ban white phosphorus. They forced the switch to red phosphorus. It cost more to make the matches, but the workers got to keep their bones. That's the so what of the whole thing. Because those girls stood their ground, the factory floor stopped being a death trap. And then there were the kids, the chimney sweeps. We're talking about 4-year-olds being pushed into soot-filled flues that weren't much wider than a dinner plate. Their elbows were raw, their knees were bloody. If they got stuck, their masters would light a fire in the hearth to encourage them to climb higher. People knew it was happening. They just liked having a warm house and a clean chimney. It took decades of shouting, but the law finally grew some teeth. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 changed everything. It made it a crime. You had to register. You had to have a license. If a cop saw a kid with a brush and a soot-stained face, the master went to jail. No questions, no excuses. So what happened? People bought mechanical brushes. They bought iron rods that could bend around corners. They didn't need a child's small frame anymore because the machine could reach the soot. The kids didn't have to die in a dark pipe just so someone could have a fire in the parlor. The law made the child too expensive, so the machine became the only choice. You see the pattern here? The world moved on because it became easier, cheaper, or more legal to use a tool instead of a human being. The grit of the old city started to wash away. The sewers got deeper and wider, built with millions of bricks that didn't care about the smell. The water got filtered through sand and stone. The professions that relied on the filth, the Toshers, the mudlarks, the pure-finders, they found themselves pushed out. The city was being paved over. The holes they crawled into were being sealed with iron grates. I want you to think about that transition. It's a story about the bottom line. The Industrial Revolution didn't just build the future, it buried the past under layers of concrete and law. The humming grid replaced the guy with the stick. The lab replaced the dung collector. The brush replaced the boy. London didn't stop smelling like a grave because we found our souls. It stopped smelling like a grave because we found a way to make a profit without the rot. The weird jobs died out because they had to. The world got faster, colder, and a lot more mechanical. The human alarms were silenced by the tick of a clock. The kids were pulled out of the chimneys and put into schools or different factories where they were at least visible. The streets were no longer a gold mine for the desperate. They were just streets. And for the first time in 1,000 years, you could walk through London, take a deep breath, and you wouldn't taste the city on your tongue. The era of the human gear was over. The machine had won.
The world didn't just wake up one day and decide to be clean. It didn't happen because people got nicer. It happened because the old way stopped working. It broke. When you look at those machines, don't just see gears and steam. See the end of a nightmare. Think about the leech collectors. They didn't do it for the science. They did it because they were hungry. They used their own bodies as bait. They let worms drain their blood just to buy a loaf of bread. But then doctors stopped believing in bloodletting. They started looking through microscopes. They found out that germs, not bad blood, were the killers. So the collectors stepped out of the ponds. They washed the mud off their legs for the last time. The worms stayed in the water, and we got medicine that actually worked. Then you had the mudlarks, kids crawling through the low-tide muck of the Thames, looking for a dropped coin or a scrap of iron. They lived on what we threw away. But as the factories grew, the waste got worse. It wasn't just scraps anymore. It was chemicals. It was filth that would peel the skin off your bones. Society looked at those kids and finally saw a mirror. We realized a city that eats its children isn't a city, it's a slaughterhouse. So we changed the rules. We didn't just ask nicely. People fought. They walked off the job. They stood in the street until the bosses had no choice but to listen. That's where your weekend comes from. That's why you don't see 7-year-olds climbing into chimneys anymore. We passed the laws because the alternative was too bloody to ignore. We traded the climbing boy for the chimney brush and eventually for the furnace. We stopped using humans as disposable parts. And the smell. You can't imagine the smell. London used to be an open sewer. People like the Pure Finders spent their lives picking up dog poop because the leather industry needed it. Think about that next time you put on a pair of boots. Your shoes exist because someone spent 12 hours a day with a bucket and a prayer dodging carriage wheels. But in 1858, the heat turned the river into a wall of rot. They called it the Great Stink. The guys in Parliament tried to ignore it. They soaked their curtains in lime to hide the scent. It didn't work. The smell of the poor finally reached the noses of the rich. And because those politicians couldn't breathe, they finally built the sewers. They dug miles of brick tunnels. They hid our waste underground. They gave us the flush toilet and took away the cholera. They did it to save themselves, but they ended up saving all of us. It's easy to look back and feel sorry for them. It's easy to call it the good old days or some romantic struggle. It wasn't. It was a grind. It was a fight to stay alive until sunset. They had survival. They did the jobs that would make a modern person vomit in seconds. They did it so we wouldn't have to. Today, you might hate your office. You might hate your boss. You might think your commute is a soul-crushing drag. And maybe it is. But look at your hands. They aren't stained with dog poop. Your lungs aren't full of soot. Your legs aren't covered in leech bites. We live in the world they built with their sweat and their blood.
We have clean water because they died of thirst. We have safety laws because they got crushed in the gears. We have a life because they survived a hell we can barely imagine. So, next time you're sitting at your desk or standing behind a counter and you feel like the day is never going to end, take a breath. A clean breath, one that doesn't taste like coal or sewage. Remember the mudlark. Remember the pure finder. Remember that the human gear is gone and you're the one who got to walk away. I'm done here. If you want to see how we almost lost it all again, hit the link for the next one.
Otherwise, go enjoy your weekend. You earned it. They paid for it. See you next time.